Love is universal, right? A deeply personal and emotional experience that should belong only to you and your partner. Well, not exactly. Not if you lived in the Soviet Union. In the USSR, love was more than just a private feeling. It was a collective responsibility, something closely supervised by the Communist Party itself. From early childhood, Soviet citizens were taught that their personal lives weren't completely their own. Instead, relationships were supposed to serve society as a whole. The Soviet government believed that strong romantic relationships were essential to building a productive communist society. Marriage and family weren't just personal milestones, they were political statements. Choosing a spouse meant choosing someone who shared your loyalty to communist ideals, who would help raise children as faithful, productive citizens. This wasn't about sparks or passion. It was about ideological compatibility and social acceptability. From their teenage years, young Soviets joined organizations like the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, where the party closely influenced their views on love and relationships. These youth groups didn't just teach political slogans and Marxist ideology. They actively organized dating events and lectures on socialist romance, encouraging young people to see love not just as a private joy, but as a tool to strengthen the communist system. Soviet propaganda reinforced these ideals constantly. Movies, posters, books, and even children's cartoons depicted ideal couples whose first loyalty was always to the state. Romantic stories focused on couples meeting at factories or farms, united by their dedication to building socialism. Affection was shown modestly and discreetly. Too much passion was considered bourgeois decadence, and it wasn't just propaganda. The state actively interfered in the private lives of citizens. Couples who wanted to marry had to receive official approval, passing ideological checks and background investigations. Relationships were watched closely, often secretly monitored by the KGB. Even simple romantic gestures were subject to scrutiny. All of this created a bizarre and complicated culture of romance, where true emotions had to coexist with relentless political pressure. Love in the Soviet Union might seem completely alien to us today, regulated, supervised, and sometimes repressed. But beneath this strange and tightly controlled surface, ordinary people still manage to find authentic human connection, often in extraordinary ways, ready to dive deeper into this fascinating world of Soviet-style dating and marriage. Trust me, it's nothing like you've imagined. So, how exactly did Soviet citizens find romance under these strict conditions? In a country where traditional dating was viewed with suspicion, the Soviet Union created its own uniquely communist solutions for matchmaking, and they were as strange and bureaucratic as you might imagine. First, there were the official state-run marriage bureaus. These weren't casual dating services like we have today. They were government-operated institutions tasked with pairing up compatible citizens based on detailed questionnaires. Applicants had to fill out extensive forms listing their job, their income, their political views, their contributions to socialism, and even their hobbies, as long as they aligned with party ideals. Matches weren't based on chemistry or romance. They were based on ideological correctness, social class, and practical compatibility. Then there were the newspaper advertisements. Publications like Pravda and Izvestia ran carefully censored personal ads. These ads might seem familiar at first glance, but the details were anything but ordinary. Imagine reading something like 28-year-old female factory worker, devoted to building socialism, seeks marriage with ideologically pure Soviet citizen, who enjoys productive labor and cultural enrichment. These ads weren't merely suggestions. They were tightly controlled by editors and political officials who filtered out anything they deemed inappropriate or ideologically suspect. If official matchmaking or newspaper ads didn't work out, young people could always meet potential partners at Communist Party events and youth clubs. such as those run by the Komsomol. Here, romance was carefully engineered through collective social activities like group dances, state-approved movie nights, and ideological study circles. The party encouraged these group gatherings because they were considered safer, easier to supervise, and less likely to encourage inappropriate Western-style behaviours. Even after you met someone you liked at these events, your relationship wasn't entirely private. You had to report your romance to local authorities or party officials, who would then investigate your suitability as a couple. Officials checked your family backgrounds, political reliability, and social behaviour to ensure your relationship aligned with the state's interests. Despite all these hurdles and bureaucratic nightmares, Soviet citizens still pursued relationships. Yes, the path to finding a partner was deeply controlled, bureaucratic, and far from romantic, but human emotions are hard to regulate entirely. Love often managed to flourish, hidden just beneath the surface of official paperwork and communist ideology. And that's just the beginning. Let's keep going, because dating in the USSR was about to get even more complicated. Imagine going on a date knowing that everything you say or do could potentially be scrutinized, reported, or recorded. Welcome to the complicated world of Soviet dating etiquette, a strange balancing act between personal feelings and political expectations. Dates in the Soviet Union weren't typically romantic candlelit dinners or spontaneous evenings out on the town. Instead, dating involved carefully planned outings to places deemed ideologically appropriate by the Communist Party. Couples often found themselves strolling through state-approved parks, visiting museums displaying Soviet history, or attending theatre productions that promoted socialist values. Even the simplest date was subject to careful planning and political correctness. Movie theatres only showed films that had passed strict censorship. Restaurants served simple, state-approved menus without any extravagant or capitalist choices. Cafes and bars were scarce, and the ones that existed often had a sterile, uninviting atmosphere, designed intentionally to discourage Western-style leisure activities. But the complications didn't end there. Conversations during dates were filled with subtle danger. Certain topics were strictly off limits, even when talking to a potential life partner, criticizing the Communist Party, expressing admiration for Western lifestyles, or even joking about government policies could land couples in serious trouble. The KGB was known to recruit informants who listened in on conversations, making every exchange potentially risky. Public displays of affection, they weren't illegal, but they were considered suspiciously Western. Excessive hand-holding, kissing, or hugging in public could attract unwanted attention or even reprimands from local officials. A good Soviet couple was expected to demonstrate a disciplined and reserved affection, showing respect for socialist morality above personal desire. Even gifts exchanged between couples carried ideological weight. Flowers and books were acceptable, but imported goods, fashionable clothes, or luxury items could draw scrutiny from authorities. Romantic gestures had to be carefully balanced to avoid the accusation of being materialistic or influenced by Western decadence. Despite all these restrictions, couples found small ways to express genuine feelings. Secret notes were exchanged discreetly. Coded language was often used to discuss sensitive or personal topics. Meetings sometimes took place in quieter, less monitored spaces where true emotions could surface briefly, away from the watchful eyes of informants and party officials. Dating in the Soviet Union wasn't just about getting to know another person, it was about navigating a complex maze of social expectations, ideological pressures, and constant surveillance. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade, love and romance still found a way, adapting quietly and courageously in the shadows of state control. Ready to hear about marriage? Trust me, things were about to get even stranger. Congratulations, you found someone special, navigated the complexities of Soviet dating, and now you're ready to take the next big step: marriage. But in the Soviet Union, getting married wasn't as simple as saying "I do." Your union required the explicit approval of the Communist Party, and this meant navigating a daunting maze of bureaucracy, ideological scrutiny, and invasive personal investigations. To get married, Soviet couples first had to apply for official permission at their local government office. This wasn't just a quick formality, it was a thorough evaluation designed to ensure the marriage would support and strengthen socialist society. Each partner filled out extensive paperwork detailing their family history, employment record, ideological beliefs, and political reliability. No stone was left unturned in assessing the couple's potential contribution to the Soviet collective. The Communist Party didn't stop at paperwork. Couples often faced intrusive background checks by local officials, neighborhood committees, and even the KGB. Authorities interviewed neighbors, friends, colleagues, and relatives, seeking insights into the couple's daily behaviors, political attitudes, and moral character. Imagine having to prove your ideological purity and socialist dedication just to marry someone you loved. Any suspicion, even minor, could jeopardize a marriage application. If either partner had relatives abroad, past political transgressions, or perceived sympathy toward Western culture, the application could be delayed, questioned, or flatly rejected. Couples sometimes waited months or even years for official approval, living in constant uncertainty. Marrying a foreigner was especially challenging. Such relationships were viewed with suspicion, often labelled a threat to Soviet security. Special permits from the highest authorities were required, and marriages involving foreigners typically triggered even deeper scrutiny. The KGB frequently intervened, closely monitoring the relationship to prevent potential espionage or ideological contamination. Even when approval was granted, couples were often warned about proper behaviour and their duty to socialist principles. They were lectured about how their marriage should serve society, produce ideologically correct children, and promote communist values within their community. In short, getting married in the Soviet Union wasn't just about love and commitment. It was about proving loyalty, passing tests, and obtaining permission from the state. The Communist Party's tight grip over marriage was another powerful reminder that personal happiness was always secondary to ideological purity and political control. And yet, despite all the hurdles, couples still managed to find their way to the altar. Because even in a tightly controlled society, the desire for love and companionship could not be completely suppressed. But once married, how did Soviet couples actually celebrate their unions? Brace yourself. The wedding ceremonies themselves were equally unusual and uniquely Soviet. So, you've received official permission from the Communist Party to marry the person you love. No small feat. But what exactly did a Soviet wedding look like? Well, it certainly wasn't the fairy tale you might imagine. Instead, Soviet weddings came with a unique set of traditions, rituals, and strange government-mandated practices that set them apart from ceremonies anywhere else in the world. Firstly, forget lavish ceremonies in beautiful churches or extravagant hotels. Soviet weddings took place in drab, official government buildings known as palaces of marriage. These weren't palaces by any stretch. Typically, they were modest municipal buildings decorated plainly, featuring Soviet flags, state symbols, and communist propaganda rather than flowers or romantic decor. Wedding ceremonies themselves were carefully scripted to reflect communist ideals. Instead of exchanging heartfelt vows or personal promises, couples listened to long official speeches about their responsibility to the Soviet state and their role in building a socialist society. Officials reminded newlyweds that their marriage was not simply a private affair. It was an important political duty, aimed at raising a new generation of loyal communist citizens. Music choices were strictly controlled. Romantic Western love songs were out of the question. Instead, state-approved Soviet anthems and folk songs emphasizing collective unity, labor, and national pride, provided the soundtrack to the big day. Even wedding attire was limited and modest. Brides typically wore simple dresses, often homemade or borrowed, while extravagant white gowns or imported fashions were frowned upon as overly materialistic. Grooms wore their best suit, or sometimes their military or worker uniforms, symbolizing their role as productive members of Soviet society. The wedding reception afterward was equally modest. Lavish celebrations were strongly discouraged and considered a capitalist extravagance. Instead, couples typically hosted simple gatherings with close friends and family, enjoying traditional dishes and modest cakes. Alcohol was permitted, but excessive drinking or lavish feasting could be criticized publicly by local authorities. Despite the state's attempts to tightly control wedding celebrations, some couples still found quiet ways to incorporate their personal touches. Secretly, at home, or in small private gatherings, couples might indulge in special homemade treats, exchange private romantic gestures, or sneak in Western music quietly among friends. However, these moments had to remain subtle and hidden from prying eyes. Soviet weddings, therefore, became a bizarre blend of strict ideology and quiet personal rebellion. They were starkly official events where personal feelings took a back seat to public declarations of loyalty to the state. But beneath these controlled and regulated ceremonies, human emotion and genuine love still found a way to surface, making each wedding uniquely poignant. Next, what if the marriage didn't work out? Strangely enough, divorces in the Soviet Union were surprisingly common and remarkably straightforward, but they came with their own complications and unexpected consequences. Let's dive into that next. You might assume that in a society as strictly controlled as the Soviet Union, getting a divorce would be complicated, difficult, or even impossible. But surprisingly, the opposite was true. Divorce was relatively easy, widespread, and even considered quite normal in the USSR. However, that doesn't mean divorce didn't come with its own unique complications and social consequences. In the Soviet Union, marriage was officially seen as a practical arrangement rather than a romantic union. If a marriage wasn't serving its purpose, meaning it wasn't producing children, contributing positively to society, or functioning smoothly, the government had little interest in forcing couples to stay together. Consequently, the process for obtaining a divorce was usually straightforward and surprisingly efficient. Instead of complicated court proceedings or lengthy disputes, Soviet divorces often went through local committees or administrative offices. Couples filed paperwork, briefly explained their reasons, and frequently, divorce would be granted without major hassle. Because Soviet marriages often lacked the romantic expectations associated with marriage in the West, breakups were accepted pragmatically rather than dramatically. However, despite this ease, divorce carried subtle social stigmas. Individuals, especially women, faced judgment and suspicion from society. Divorce was seen by many as evidence of personal failure or weakness, indicating an inability to maintain a stable household and uphold socialist ideals. Divorced individuals, especially single mothers, faced significant challenges, including social isolation, financial hardship, and difficulty finding new housing in a system already strained by shortages. Interestingly, despite the high divorce rate, the Soviet government tried actively to discourage divorce through mediation efforts and official counseling. Local authorities and party officials would intervene when couples announced plans to divorce, attempting to reconcile the partners or resolve practical disputes. They saw divorce as disruptive to social stability, even if it was relatively common. The government also closely monitored divorced couples, particularly those with children, to ensure that family life still conformed to socialist standards. Single parents were often subject to increased scrutiny, with local authorities watching closely to ensure proper childcare, moral upbringing, and ideological instruction. Yet, despite these pressures, divorce remained widespread. Economic hardships, cramped communal living conditions, ideological expectations, and general unhappiness all contributed to frequent breakups. In fact, by the 1970s and 1980s, divorce had become a normalized feature of Soviet life, surprising outsiders who expected stricter social controls. In short, divorce in the Soviet Union was paradoxical, easy to achieve yet socially complicated, accepted but quietly judged, pragmatic but emotionally taxing. It demonstrated clearly the tensions between individual desire and collective expectation. Yet another fascinating example of how complicated personal life could be under Soviet rule. But even with all these challenges and regulations, Soviet citizens never stopped seeking genuine romance and intimacy, and they often did so in secretive, creative, and sometimes risky ways. Let's explore the world of hidden Soviet romance next. In a society where even the most private matters were closely watched, how did Soviet citizens find room for true romance? How could genuine human affection survive constant scrutiny by neighbors, informants, and even the KGB? Surprisingly and inspiringly, it always did. Soviet couples became experts in secrecy. They learned to navigate the complexities of surveillance and state interference with incredible creativity. Love letters were written in code, using carefully chosen words and subtle references to express true feelings while avoiding the suspicion of censors. Young couples developed ingenious secret signals to communicate discreetly. Certain knocks on shared apartment doors, signals passed through curtains or windows, and messages hidden within mundane conversations became common practices. They mastered the art of quickly switching conversations when someone suspicious approached, creating private worlds right under the noses of authorities. Dates frequently took place in less conspicuous settings, abandoned parks, distant forests, or quiet corners of crowded public spaces where they could whisper privately without fear of being overheard. Every private moment became precious and carefully guarded, a small triumph against the intrusive eyes of the state. Some daring couples even defied Soviet conventions more openly, privately enjoying forbidden Western books, secretly listening to banned romantic music, or quietly celebrating intimate milestones away from prying eyes. These small acts of rebellion provided a powerful sense of freedom, fueling their romance despite the risks involved. And the risks were very real. Being caught breaking social rules could lead to social humiliation, harsh criticism, or even political trouble. Yet, despite the potential consequences, Soviet couples bravely continued finding ways to nurture genuine connections. Love, after all, has always thrived most powerfully when challenged. And that's the beautiful irony. In a place that attempted to control every detail of life, ordinary people refused to let love be extinguished. Romance didn't vanish under state pressure. It flourished quietly, beautifully, and defiantly. The Soviet government might have tried to control love, marriage, and dating, but ultimately, it never could. Genuine affection always found a path, slipping through the cracks of surveillance, evading the grasp of ideological control. Because in the end, no government could ever fully contain the power of love.